Jessica Fletcher and the Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1. A Sinister Invitation. Jessica Fletcher had always prided herself on her keen observational skills, but nothing could have prepared her for the unsettling feeling that crept over her as she opened the envelope. The rich, gold-embossed stationery glinted in the late afternoon light, an invitation to Ashford Manor's grand reopening. She didn't know what it was about the letter that unsettled her, but a feeling of dread gripped her as she read the elegantly penned note inside. The invitation, from her longtime friend, Thomas Hayward, was written in the most formal of tones. Thomas, a man of considerable wealth and influence, had recently inherited Ashford Manor after the death of his uncle, the previous owner. The manor, located just outside the small New England village of Briarwood, was a sprawling estate set against the backdrop of a dense forest. A place Jessica had heard many rumors about, but never fully believed. The event was a dinner to mark the reopening of the estate, and as she read, Jessica found herself drawn into a mystery she hadn't yet fully understood. Thomas had been a respected historian, a man who studied local lore and secrets of the past, but the last time they had spoken, he seemed preoccupied with something he wouldn't share. The tone of the invitation felt odd, almost desperate, as though he was trying to tell her something without saying it aloud. Jessica's instincts told her that this would be no ordinary dinner. Despite her reservations, she decided to attend. After all, she couldn't resist the allure of a new mystery. Her sharp mind, honed from years of solving mysteries through her writing, was already beginning to work through the puzzle. What had Thomas gotten himself involved in? And why had he invited her to his estate for what appeared to be an unusually private event? She made her preparations and arrived at Ashford Manor as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the estate's expansive grounds. The imposing silhouette of the manor loomed before her, an old building with turrets and ivy-covered walls that whispered of secrets buried deep within its past. The front door creaked open as a servant in a black suit greeted her. He led her through the grand hall, where dark wood paneling and antique furniture gave the place an air of neglect. There was a quiet eeriness to the place, something that didn't sit well with Jessica. The silence in the halls was only interrupted by the soft creaking of floorboards beneath her feet. As she was escorted into the drawing room, she caught sight of the guests. There were not many, but each one seemed oddly out of place. There was Julia Hawke, a local historian who had been a competitor of Thomas for many years, always vying for recognition in the academic world. Julia was a striking woman, dressed in a black dress, but her icy demeanor gave her an almost predatory air. Beside her was Gregory Sinclair, a businessman with a penchant for the extravagant, and a man with a recent history of financial difficulties. At the far end of the room stood Thomas's wife, Vanessa Carlton, a woman much younger than Thomas, with a coldness in her eyes that sent a shiver down Jessica's spine. Jessica quickly realized that the gathering was anything but casual. The conversations were clipped, forced. There was tension in the air, a palpable discomfort that filled the room. As the guests exchanged pleasantries, Jessica began to observe. She studied the way Julia's lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes, the way Gregory's fingers nervously tapped the edge of his glass, and how Vanessa seemed more interested in the shadows than in engaging with the others. Dinner was served in the grand dining hall, the large, arched windows framing a view of the sprawling estate grounds. The food was sumptuous, and the conversation grew louder as the wine flowed freely. Jessica, ever the observer, noted the glances exchanged between the guests, the way they avoided talking about Thomas's recent research. He had been deeply invested in the history of Ashford Manor, and rumors had swirled about the manor's dark past. Rumors that even Jessica found difficult to ignore. After the main course, Thomas stood and excused himself, offering a brief toast to his guests. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. But there was something in his tone that unsettled Jessica. It was as though he was attempting to mask something darker, something buried beneath the surface of his words. Not long after Thomas's toast, the evening took a dark turn. A loud crash echoed through the manor, followed by a scream. The guests rushed to the hallway, where they found Thomas lying at the foot of the grand staircase, his body twisted in a way that suggested a violent fall. His eyes were wide, locked in an expression of shock. The eerie stillness of the manor deepened as they gathered around him, realizing the true horror that had unfolded. Jessica's instincts kicked in immediately. She bent down to examine the scene, noting the way his hand was clutched tightly around something. It was a small, folded piece of paper which she gently pried from his fingers. Unfolding it, she found the words scrawled across the page. "The shadows speak of things untold." Her heart skipped a beat. The cryptic note seemed like a message from beyond the grave, and as Jessica looked around at the shocked faces of the guests, she realized that someone in that room was responsible for Thomas's death. She was certain of one thing: this wasn't just an accident. It was murder. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The manor was unusually quiet after the discovery of Thomas Hayward's body. The loud crash that had announced his fall echoed in Jessica's mind, a dreadful reminder of the tragedy that had just occurred. The guests were still in shock, scattered in the large drawing room, muttering among themselves, as though waiting for someone to explain what had happened. The silence, however, was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Detective Calloway, the local constable. Calloway was a stout man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and a pair of sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His initial reaction to Jessica's presence was one of resistance. "This is a crime scene, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm afraid your involvement will only complicate matters," he said, eyeing her warily. Jessica had worked alongside law enforcement before, and while she was well aware of the constable's desire to retain control, she couldn't help but notice the barely concealed unease in his voice. "I assure you, Detective, I'm not here to make things harder for you," Jessica said calmly. "But I am certain there is more to this than meets the eye." Calloway didn't answer her immediately, but waved the servants away to allow the guests to return to their rooms. Jessica noticed, however, that he had already started examining the staircase and the area around Thomas's body. The detective's eyes swept the surroundings as though trying to piece together what had transpired. Jessica's own sharp eyes didn't miss the details. As she stood beside the staircase, she studied Thomas's position. He had fallen in such a way that suggested he had been either pushed or had struggled before losing his footing. The angle of his body was unnatural, and the expression on his face, an awful mix of surprise and terror, seemed out of place for someone who had simply tripped. The moment Jessica noticed something peculiar, her heart quickened. A red stain marred the once pristine rug beneath Thomas's body. It wasn't a large amount, but it was enough to make her wonder, had Thomas been injured before the fall? The stain seemed to be wine, rich, dark red, and it spread beneath his body, stopping just before the edge of the rug. Jessica knelt down carefully, her fingers brushing the stain. It was still wet. That meant the wine had been spilled just moments before the fall. This couldn't be an accident. "Detective," Jessica called. "I think we need to take a closer look at this." Calloway stepped over and peered down at the stain. "Wine, no doubt. Probably from the dinner," he muttered, clearly unfazed. He straightened up, gesturing toward the servants who were still in the background. "Get rid of that rug and clean the floor. We need to keep this place tidy." Jessica frowned. The detective had missed something important. But there was no time to argue. Instead, she stood and began to scan the area around the body for any other clues. She noticed the faintest disturbance near the stairs, where the carpet was slightly wrinkled, as though something heavy had been dragged over it recently. As she knelt to get a better look at the rug, something caught her eye. There was a small piece of paper, folded, crumpled, and soaked in the wine stain. Jessica carefully extracted it, smoothing it out to reveal a faintly written message. "The shadows speak of things untold." The same cryptic phrase from the note Thomas had clutched in his hand. "Curious," Jessica murmured under her breath, noting the coincidence. She tucked the paper into her pocket, her mind racing with the implications. Who had written this note? Why had it been left behind in such a conspicuous place? And what did it mean? As Jessica mulled over the note, she heard Calloway's footsteps behind her. He was speaking to one of the servants, but Jessica was too lost in her thoughts to pay much attention. She was certain the wine spill was no accident, but the puzzle pieces weren't quite fitting together. Thomas had been involved in researching the occult and the dark past of Ashford Manor, and Jessica began to wonder if it wasn't just a personal tragedy. What if it was connected to the secrets of the house itself? Calloway, in the meantime, had finished his conversation and returned to Jessica's side, looking more agitated than ever. "The others have returned to their rooms. We'll have a formal questioning tomorrow. But for now, I suggest you leave this to the professionals." Jessica smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew there was more to this than the detective was willing to acknowledge. She had to get to the bottom of it herself. "I'll leave you to it, detective," she said, stepping back from the scene. As she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on the staircase again. Something about the way Thomas had fallen, The way the blood had pooled so neatly around him, it didn't sit right. Back in her room, Jessica sat by the window, the cool breeze coming in from the garden. She could hear the sound of the others talking downstairs, but she was too consumed by the mystery to pay them any mind. She was certain that the answers lay hidden within the manor, but the question was, where to begin? After a moment of contemplation, she knew. The family's history was steeped in secrecy, and Thomas had been researching the estate's past in a way that had unsettled many people. Jessica recalled the cryptic note again and its eerie message. She realized she needed to examine every inch of the manor to uncover what was hidden beneath the surface, just as she had done so many times in the past with her books. With a deep breath, she stood and made her way down the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as she approached the library. She knew there were secrets in that room. There had to be. But just as Jessica reached for the door handle, she froze. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from within. Chapter 3: The Whispering Shadows. Jessica entered the library with a quiet confidence, her every step deliberate. As the door creaked open, the musty scent of old books and polished wood filled her nostrils. The large, dusty shelves lined the walls, each filled with countless volumes that seemed to whisper secrets from centuries past. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on a large mahogany desk near the center. But it was the eerie silence of the space that unsettled Jessica most, an oppressive stillness that made her feel as though the room itself were watching her. Inside, she was not alone. Standing by the window, her back to Jessica, was Julia Hawke, the historian. Julia had a habit of being where she wasn't expected, an unsettling tendency that Jessica had observed earlier. Julia had been one of the guests at dinner, but after Thomas's fall, she had been oddly quiet, keeping to herself. Now, here she was, clearly in the midst of some task she was not keen to share. Julia's slender frame was draped in a long, dark dress, and her fingers brushed the edges of an ancient manuscript she had pulled from one of the shelves. "Oh, Mrs. Fletcher," Julia said, her voice smooth but with an undercurrent of tension. She turned slowly, her pale face framed by dark, curling hair. "I didn't expect to see you here so soon." Jessica regarded her carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, stepping further into the room. "I've been going over some things. I thought this might be the best place to start." Her gaze flickered to the old manuscript in Julia's hands. "What are you looking at?" Julia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to the pages of the book. "Just some old records," she said nonchalantly, her tone betraying no hint of guilt. Thomas had been researching Ashford Manor's history for months, and there's so much that remains buried. Things that, perhaps, should stay buried. The emphasis Julia placed on the last few words sent a chill down Jessica's spine. There was something about the historian's words, a subtle warning that didn't quite match the polite mask she wore. Jessica's eyes scanned the room, taking in the wealth of knowledge stored in the dusty books and papers scattered across the desk. It was clear that Julia was hiding something. Why would she be looking through records, especially now, after the tragedy? I'm sure Thomas was more than capable of handling his research alone, Jessica said, her voice calm but firm. Why the sudden interest in his findings, Julia? I thought you two were rivals in the academic world. Julia stiffened slightly, but quickly regained her composure. Rivals? Hardly. Thomas and I may have had our differences, but we both shared a deep love for the history of this place. It's why we spent so much time researching it together. Jessica wasn't buying it. The tension in Julia's posture spoke volumes. She could see through the carefully constructed facade, sensing the layers of deceit just beneath the surface. There was something more to this relationship than simple rivalry. Something darker. Tell me, Julia, Jessica said, moving a step closer. What exactly did Thomas uncover that led to his untimely end? Julia's face went pale at the question, her fingers tightening around the manuscript. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice strained. Thomas was researching old manuscripts, local myths, things that had been forgotten. He was obsessed with finding out more about the manor's history, and She stopped herself mid-sentence, her eyes widening. She had said too much. Jessica felt the shift in the room, the subtle change in Julia's demeanor. What was he searching for, Julia? What did he find that was so dangerous? Julia turned away from her, setting the manuscript down with a deliberate slowness. It's none of your business, she snapped, her tone sharp and defensive. Thomas was an intelligent man, but he got in too deep. You can't understand what he was dealing with here. Before Jessica could press further, a sound interrupted them, a loud knock at the door. Startled, Julia jumped back, her face quickly returning to its mask of composure. Yes, she called, trying to steady her breath. The door opened to reveal Gregory Sinclair, his eyes flickering with unease. I thought I heard voices, he said with a forced smile. Everything all right in here? Jessica studied Gregory for a moment, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. His appearance was one of the wealthiest men in the room, but now he looked far from the confident businessman he had been earlier. The loss of his fortune had clearly affected him, and something about him seemed to be on edge, as though he feared being discovered. I was just showing Mrs. Fletcher some of the old manuscripts, Julia said quickly, attempting to dismiss Jessica's presence. Perhaps we should all return to our rooms. It's late, and there's nothing more to be gained here. Gregory nodded, though his eyes darted nervously between Jessica and Julia. Of course, we've all been through quite a shock. I'm sure the investigation will take its course. Let's not keep the detective waiting. With that, he stepped back, motioning for Julia to leave. The sudden shift in their behavior was not lost on Jessica. She'd caught a glimpse of something far deeper than either of them were willing to admit. As they both exited the library, Jessica lingered in the doorway for a moment, her mind working quickly through the puzzle pieces that were already starting to fall into place. The phrase from Thomas's note echoed in her mind again. The shadows speak of things untold. The shadows were indeed speaking, but it was becoming clear that someone was desperately trying to silence them. Jessica needed to understand what secrets Thomas had uncovered, and why those secrets seemed to have cost him his life. Her eyes fell on the manuscript that Julia had left behind, its pages exposed and beckoning her curiosity. Without a second thought, Jessica crossed the room and retrieved it. She scanned the first few pages, but it wasn't until she reached the last page that her breath caught in her throat. They are written in small, barely legible script were the words, "The truth lies within the walls of Ashford Manor." Chapter 4. The Haunting Past. Jessica sat back in the armchair, the old manuscript still in her hands. The words written in the fading ink on the final page haunted her. The truth lies within the walls of Ashford Manor. What did it mean? What truth had Thomas uncovered? And why was it hidden within the very walls of the manor he had grown to love and, evidently, fear? The heavy silence of the library pressed in around her. She could feel the weight of the mansion's history bearing down on her. The past that seemed to be alive, watching, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. It was clear now that Thomas's research wasn't just academic. It was something far more personal and far more dangerous. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edges of the manuscript, and she noticed, to her surprise, that the pages were filled with notes, marginalia, jotted in Thomas's neat handwriting. It appeared that Thomas had been piecing together fragments of the manor's dark history, connecting events that had been buried for years. As she read, Jessica discovered that the Hayward family, who had once owned Ashford Manor, were not merely wealthy aristocrats. They were involved in secret societies, occult rituals, and, disturbingly, murder. The more Jessica read, the more the air around her seemed to grow thick with tension. Her instinct screamed that the house itself was involved. Something about its very foundation held the key to everything. She had seen it before in her years of writing and investigating. Places of power, steeped in blood, held onto their secrets with a vengeance. Ashford Manor was no different. The manuscript detailed the life of Lord Ashford, the manor's original owner. He had been a man obsessed with immortality, a fascination that had led him down dark paths. He dabbled in alchemy and the occult, seeking ways to commune with spirits and tap into forces beyond the mortal realm. But his experiments had been more than just an intellectual pursuit. They had cost lives. Many of those close to him had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths never fully explained. Some said it was the work of a curse, while others whispered that the manor itself had taken its toll. Jessica had read enough to realize that Thomas's research had led him to the conclusion that the manor's curse was real. The whispers of the shadows weren't metaphorical. They were part of the ancient ritualistic practices that had been conducted within these very walls. What Thomas had uncovered was more than just history. It was a doorway to something far darker. As the last page turned, Jessica felt a chill crawl up her spine. It wasn't just the eerie accounts of the manor's past that troubled her. It was the fact that Thomas had planned to publish this research, to expose the secrets that had been hidden for generations. He had been too close to something, too close to the truth, and it had cost him his life. Suddenly, a sound from the doorway made Jessica freeze. She quickly shoved the manuscript back into the desk drawer, as though hiding it would shield her from whatever had just entered the room. She turned to find Gregory Sinclair standing there, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't knocked, hadn't waited for permission. He had simply entered, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if he were searching for something. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice shaky. "I need to speak with you. There's something you need to know. Something about Thomas, about what he discovered." Jessica didn't hesitate. "What are you talking about, Gregory?" she asked, her voice firm but curious. She could tell from the tension in his posture that he was hiding something important. Gregory took a step forward, his eyes flickering to the desk where the manuscript was hidden. But Jessica's gaze was already trained on him, and she could see the slight shift in his expression. He was desperate, afraid of something. "I know you've been investigating Thomas's death," he said, his voice low. "And I know you're getting close. But there are things you don't understand. Things that Thomas uncovered. Things that we couldn't stop. You need to leave, Mrs. Fletcher. You're playing a dangerous game." Jessica stood up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as she studied Gregory. "What are you afraid of?" she asked bluntly. "You're hiding something, Gregory. You were involved in Thomas's research, weren't you? You've been trying to cover up the truth, just like Julia." Gregory flinched at her words, and for a moment, she thought he might deny it. But instead, he took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had become too much for him to carry. I didn't mean for things to go this far," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas got too close to something I never wanted to deal with. There's a reason the Haywards sold the manor, a reason why it's been abandoned for so long. The curse." He paused, as if measuring how much he could say without crossing a line. "The curse is real, Mrs. Fletcher, and Thomas was going to expose it." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She had suspected it all along. The manor's haunted past, the cryptic messages, the eerie behavior of the guests. Everything pointed to something far beyond a simple murder. "Do you know who killed Thomas?" Jessica asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her mind. Gregory's face grew pale, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "It was Vanessa," he admitted. She couldn't let Thomas expose everything he had found. She knew what would happen if the truth got out. She was too close to the Hayward family's secrets, and she didn't want anyone to know what they had done. Jessica's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Vanessa, Thomas's wife, had been hiding her involvement all along. But why? What had she done to ensure that Thomas's research would never see the light of day? Before Jessica could press further, Gregory's eyes widened in fear. "You need to leave. Now," he said urgently. "It's not safe here. The manor, it's watching us." He turned quickly, as if he feared someone might overhear. But Jessica was already moving toward the door, her thoughts whirling with the implications of what Gregory had just revealed. As she left the library and made her way down the dimly lit hall, Jessica's mind was consumed with one question. What was the truth buried within the walls of Ashford Manor? And who would go to such lengths to keep it hidden? Chapter 5. The False Alibis. The heavy weight of Gregory Sinclair's confession lingered in the air as Jessica made her way through the darkened hallways of Ashford Manor. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to piece together the fragments of truth she had uncovered. Vanessa Carlton, Thomas's wife, had been the one to kill him. That much was now certain. But why? What was she hiding? And what had driven her to such extremes? The manor, with its looming shadows and oppressive silence, seemed to hold its breath as Jessica pondered these questions. She needed to find answers, but the more she uncovered, the more elusive they seemed. It was clear that everyone in the house was hiding something, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to tell who could be trusted. Jessica's first stop was the guest quarters, where the remaining guests were now holed up in their rooms, still shaken by the events of the night. It was time to start her interrogations. If there was one thing Jessica knew well, it was the art of questioning, getting people to reveal their true selves through the slightest of clues. She knocked first on the door of Julia Hawke, the historian, who had been acting suspiciously ever since the murder. It took a moment, but soon the door creaked open, revealing Julia standing inside in a loose, silk robe, her hair falling messily over her shoulders. Her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Jessica's, as if assessing whether the woman in front of her was an ally or a threat. "Mrs. Fletcher," Julia greeted, her voice a little too controlled. "What can I do for you?" "I was hoping to ask you a few more questions, Julia," Jessica said calmly, pushing the door open slightly. "About your alibi the night Thomas was killed. You said you were in the library, but no one saw you come or go. Why is that?" Julia stiffened slightly, her expression unreadable. "I told you. I was in the library reading," she said, her tone clipped. "I don't see why that matters." "I'm sure you've questioned the others as well." Jessica stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You don't find it strange that no one saw you? Not even the servants who were moving about the house?" Julia's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I suppose I could have missed them," she said with a shrug. "But I was very focused on my reading. I didn't hear anyone either." Jessica studied her for a long moment, taking in her every gesture. Julia's lack of guilt or emotion was telling, and yet, something about her calm demeanor felt forced. Jessica was certain that she was hiding something more than just a casual mistake. "I see," Jessica said after a pause. "I'll leave you to your reading then. But don't go too far, Julia. I may have more questions later." Julia nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm happy to help in any way I can." As Jessica turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that Julia was lying. There was something off about her story, too many inconsistencies, too many details that didn't quite fit. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Jessica had to keep moving. The game was afoot, and every moment counted. Her next stop was Gregory Sinclair's room, where the businessman had retreated to lick his wounds after his confession. Jessica knocked firmly on the door, and after a few moments, it was opened by Gregory himself. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot, and there was an air of unease that hung about him. "Ah, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, trying to muster a smile, but failing miserably. "What brings you to my humble quarters?" "I'm afraid I need to ask you a few questions, Gregory," Jessica replied, her voice firm. "About your whereabouts last night. You said you were in the study when Thomas died, but no one can verify that. Why is that?" Gregory's face twisted in discomfort, and for a brief moment, Jessica thought he might crumble under the pressure. But he quickly regained his composure, shifting his weight nervously. "I told you I was in the study. I had work to do. I was going through some documents, and when the crash happened, I came straight out." "Straight out?" Jessica asked, her brow furrowing. "But the door was locked from the inside, Gregory. No one could get in without your permission." Gregory's eyes darted to the door for a moment, as if checking that no one was listening. "I must have forgotten to unlock it," he said, his voice growing quieter. "It wasn't intentional. I was distracted. You know how it is when you're busy with business matters." Jessica didn't buy it. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edges of the door frame, as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. Gregory was lying, and his alibi was as shaky as a house of cards. "Gregory," Jessica said, stepping forward, her voice soft but firm. "I need the truth. Did you have anything to do with Thomas's death?" His eyes widened, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. But he quickly recovered, his expression turning back to one of forced innocence. "I had nothing to do with it, Mrs. Fletcher," he said quickly. "I swear. I was just trying to make sure everything was in order. Thomas and I may have had our differences, but I never wished him harm." Jessica didn't respond immediately, studying him for a moment longer. There was fear in his eyes, but whether it was guilt or self-preservation, she couldn't tell. Gregory was hiding something, and Jessica was sure it wasn't just his involvement in the business deal that had soured. "I see," Jessica finally said, giving him a tight smile. "You'd better hope that's the truth, Gregory, because the evidence is starting to speak for itself." With that, Jessica turned and walked away, leaving Gregory standing in the doorway. His expression was one of defeat, but there was no time to linger on him. She had one more person to question. Vanessa Carlton's room was at the far end of the manor, the most lavish and secluded of all the guest quarters. It was clear from the opulence of the room that Vanessa was accustomed to the finer things in life. The room was decorated with rich velvet curtains, fine antiques, and a large four-poster bed. But despite the luxurious surroundings, Jessica felt an unmistakable sense of coldness in the air as she knocked on the door. After a moment, Vanessa appeared, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and her posture was stiff, as though she was preparing for some sort of confrontation. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said quietly, "what can I do for you?" "I need to ask you about last night," Jessica said, her voice steady. "Your alibi is shaky at best. No one saw you at the dinner table after Thomas left, and no one saw you leave your room after the murder." Vanessa flinched at the words, her eyes darting around the room nervously. "I don't know what you want me to say. I was in my room, and I didn't." "You didn't what?" Jessica pressed, her voice sharper now. "You didn't murder your husband? You didn't try to stop him from uncovering the truth? What were you so afraid of, Vanessa?" Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her lips trembling. "I didn't want him to find out," she whispered. "He was getting too close. He was going to ruin everything." Jessica took a step forward, her gaze piercing. "What was he going to ruin, Vanessa?" But before Vanessa could answer, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by shouting. Jessica's heart raced. What was going on now? Chapter 6: The Unraveling. The crash that echoed through the manor was deafening, sending a ripple of shock through the house. Jessica's heart raced as she rushed out of Vanessa Carlton's room, her thoughts shifting immediately to the safety of the guests and the urgency of the case. The hallway was eerily silent after the loud sound, and as Jessica sprinted down the corridor toward the source of the noise, her mind was racing through the possible scenarios. Had someone else been attacked? Or had the killer returned to cover their tracks? When Jessica reached the source of the disturbance, she found Gregory Sinclair standing at the foot of a large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. The glass had shattered, and shards were scattered across the floor. Gregory's face was pale, his hands trembling as he tried to clear away the broken pieces. "What happened?" Jessica demanded, rushing toward him. She bent down and picked up a shard of glass, inspecting it carefully. The sharp edges glinted ominously in the light of the flickering chandelier above. I didn't mean to," Gregory stammered, his voice shaky. "It was the wind. The window. I thought I had closed it." Jessica was skeptical. She could tell Gregory was lying, though whether it was about the window or something more sinister, she couldn't yet tell. He was clearly on edge, and his face betrayed a sense of fear that was far more than what could be explained by a simple accident. "The wind," Jessica repeated, her voice tight with suspicion. "You're saying the wind caused the mirror to shatter?" Gregory shifted nervously, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. It's just the wind, Mrs. Fletcher," he repeated, his voice trembling. Jessica stood back up, eyeing him closely. Something wasn't right. Gregory had always been one of the more elusive suspects in the case, but now, this strange reaction to a simple accident made her think that he was hiding something far more significant. She didn't press him any further for the moment. The situation was growing more chaotic by the second, and she couldn't afford to get sidetracked. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, Gregory's behavior, Vanessa's vague admissions, Julia's cryptic statements. But there were still too many questions left unanswered. As Jessica made her way down the hallway, she felt a strange sensation creeping over her. The shadows that stretched across the grand manor felt like they were closing in, their presence oppressive and suffocating. Ashford Manor was alive with secrets, and Jessica knew that the truth lay hidden within its very walls, buried so deeply that only the most determined could find it. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, her eyes scanning the darkened rooms below. The dinner guests had scattered, retreating to their rooms to avoid suspicion, but Jessica knew they were all connected. Each one had something to hide, and it was only a matter of time before one of them slipped up. The faint sound of footsteps brought Jessica's attention back to the present. She turned to see Julia Hawke approaching from the end of the hall, her eyes wide with panic. Her usual cool composure was gone, replaced with something closer to fear. "Mrs. Fletcher," Julia said breathlessly, "you have to listen to me. I know what Thomas found. I know what he was going to expose." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Julia had finally cracked. She had been avoiding the truth for so long, but now it seemed as though she couldn't hold it in any longer. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, her voice steady but insistent. "What did Thomas find, Julia?" Julia's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she looked as though she were about to break down. "It's all in the manor's history," she said, her voice shaking. "The Hayward family, Thomas's ancestors, they weren't just wealthy landowners. They were involved in something much darker. Rituals, sacrifices, they believed in summoning spirits. And Thomas was going to expose it all. He had found the journals, the evidence." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Jessica's pulse quickened as she realized what Julia was saying. Thomas had uncovered the truth about the manor's dark past, something so terrible that it could destroy everything the family had worked for. "And what happened when he found it?" Jessica asked, her tone sharp. Julia's gaze dropped to the floor, her face pale with guilt. Vanessa knew what he had found. She couldn't let it get out. It would ruin everything. And that's why she killed him. Jessica felt a surge of realization. Vanessa had known. She had been trying to protect the family's legacy at any cost, even if it meant murder. But there was still more to this story. The past wasn't finished with Ashford Manor yet. "Where are the journals, Julia?" Jessica asked, her voice quiet but insistent. "Where did Thomas keep them?" Julia hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "In the study," she said at last. "He hid them in a secret compartment beneath the floorboards. But be careful, Mrs. Fletcher. There's a reason no one's ever found them. The manor has a way of protecting its secrets." Jessica nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The study would be the next place to search. She had to find those journals. The truth lay hidden in them, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Before she could make her way to the study, there was another interruption. This time, the sound of a door slamming open. Jessica turned to find Vanessa standing at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of fury and desperation. "You," Vanessa hissed, her eyes blazing with rage. "You've been snooping around, haven't you? Looking for things that don't concern you." Jessica held her ground, her expression calm but firm. "Vanessa, I'm only looking for the truth. And I'm going to find it, whether you like it or not." Vanessa took a step forward, her face twisted in anger. "You don't understand, Mrs. Fletcher. You don't know what you're dealing with. You've stumbled into something far bigger than you could ever imagine. You won't leave here alive if you keep digging." The threat hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Jessica could feel the tension between them crackling, like a live wire ready to snap. But she refused to be intimidated. She had come too far to back down now. "I'm not afraid of you, Vanessa," Jessica said firmly. "I'm going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jessica thought the confrontation would escalate further. But instead, Vanessa turned sharply and retreated into the shadows, her footsteps echoing through the dark halls. Jessica stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing. She knew that Vanessa was dangerous, that she would stop at nothing to protect the family's dark secrets. But Jessica was determined to expose them, to bring justice to the man who had been murdered in cold blood. The game was no longer just a puzzle to solve. It was a race against time, and Jessica was determined to finish it. Chapter 7: The Reckoning. Jessica stood in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The confrontation with Vanessa had left her rattled, but she knew she couldn't let fear take hold now. She had learned too much to back away from the truth. The eerie weight of Ashford Manor pressed down on her shoulders, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She had to find those journals, the key to unlocking the secrets of the Hayward family and the curse that had haunted them for generations. As she made her way toward the study, Jessica's thoughts raced. Julia had confessed that the journals were hidden beneath the floorboards, but the warning she'd given Jessica echoed in her mind. The manor has a way of protecting its secrets. What did that mean? Could there be more to the manor than just a tragic past? Was there something supernatural at play here? Jessica dismissed the thought. No, this was about people, greed, power, and a desperate desire to keep dark truths hidden. She had seen it before in her investigations, and she wouldn't let fear cloud her judgment now. The study was just ahead, a door at the end of a long corridor. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, and the dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room. Jessica pushed the door open and stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the surroundings. The study was exactly what one might expect from a wealthy historian's private retreat. Large, leather-bound bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk stood at the center of the room. The walls were adorned with portraits of the Hayward family, their stern faces staring down at Jessica as though silently judging her. The air smelled of old books and the faintest trace of dust. Her eyes were drawn to the desk first. Papers were scattered across its surface, some half-opened, others hastily stacked. Jessica rifled through the documents, but found nothing particularly useful. just letters, research notes, and some old blueprints of the manor. She turned away, frustration creeping in. Was she missing something? The journals had to be here. They had to be. She crouched down and began inspecting the floorboards. There was no visible sign of any loose boards, but Jessica knew that this kind of hiding spot was usually subtle, designed to be overlooked by the untrained eye. She ran her fingers along the wooden edges of the floor, pressing gently, feeling for any give. After what felt like an eternity, she finally found it. A small, nearly imperceptible seam in the floor, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She pressed down, and with a slight creak, a section of the floorboard shifted open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. There, lying in the compartment, were several old, worn journals. They were bound in dark leather, their pages yellowed with age. She reached down and pulled one out, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The writing was dense, filled with the kind of meticulous notes that only someone deeply invested in a subject could make. As she skimmed the pages, the weight of the history in her hands settled on her. These were the journals of Lord Ashford, the very man who had started the curse that had plagued the manor. The journals detailed everything: the occult practices, the dark rituals, and the terrible price that had been paid to summon spirits and gain immortality. Jessica flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the frantic entries. The deeper she read, the more horrified she became. Lord Ashford had been a man obsessed with power, willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to achieve his twisted goals. And, as she read further, Jessica realized that Thomas had been on the brink of uncovering something far worse than she had anticipated. The last few pages were particularly chilling. They spoke of a ritual, a final, desperate attempt to achieve immortality. But it wasn't just immortality for Lord Ashford. The ritual had required a blood sacrifice, someone close to him, someone within his own family. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, described how the ritual had gone horribly wrong, and how the price for immortality had not been what Lord Ashford expected. Jessica's mind raced. This was what Thomas had uncovered. The truth about the family's past. The dark forces that had been at play within Ashford Manor. But what had Thomas planned to do with this information? Had he been planning to expose it to the world? And if so, why had he been murdered? Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You found them, didn't you?" Jessica spun around, her heart racing. Standing in the doorway was Vanessa Carlton, her face twisted in a mixture of fear and anger. She had been following Jessica. "You were right about one thing, Mrs. Fletcher," Vanessa continued, her voice low and deadly. "The truth doesn't belong in the light. It never has. Some things are better left buried." Jessica's hand tightened around the journal. She was no longer afraid. The pieces were finally coming together, and she wasn't going to let Vanessa stop her now. "I'm not afraid of you, Vanessa," Jessica said, her voice steady. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. About you, about your family, and about what really happened to Thomas." Vanessa took a step forward, her eyes narrowing with cold fury. "You don't understand, Mrs. Fletcher," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "What you've uncovered, it's not just about Thomas. It's about the legacy of the Hayward family. The power we hold, what we've always held. And you," she sneered, "you think you can bring it all crashing down? You're nothing but a writer. A woman who believes she can fix things with words." Jessica took a deep breath, her resolve unshaken. "You may be right. But I know this much. Whatever power you think you have, whatever darkness you're hiding, it won't stop me from exposing the truth. You killed Thomas to protect your family's lies, but you won't stop me. Not now. Not ever." Vanessa's face contorted with rage, but for a moment, Jessica thought she saw something else flicker in her eyes. Fear. Vanessa wasn't as invincible as she had seemed. "I won't let you do this," Vanessa whispered, taking another step forward. "I won't let you ruin everything we've worked for." Jessica stepped back, her gaze never leaving Vanessa's face. "It's already too late for that." Before Vanessa could make another move, Jessica turned and rushed toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she stopped, the weight of the moment sinking in. The truth was out now. There was no going back. Chapter 8. The Legacy Rewritten. The air in Ashford Manor felt heavier now, as if the house itself had heard the footsteps of justice drawing nearer. Jessica stood at the threshold of the study, the journals clutched tightly in her hands, the weight of the truth more suffocating than ever. She had come too far to turn back now. The final chapter of this sordid tale was close at hand, and she could feel the specter of Thomas Hayward's tragic death lingering over every inch of the manor. Vanessa's threat echoed in her mind. "I won't let you ruin everything we've worked for." But Jessica was undeterred. The legacy of the Hayward family, built on deceit and blood, could no longer be protected. It was time for the truth to come into the light, no matter what it cost. With the journals tucked under her arm, Jessica made her way to the grand hall, where the remaining guests were gathered. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously as if they could feel the storm approaching. They all knew that the truth was unraveling, and each one of them carried the weight of their own secrets. Gregory Sinclair was standing by the fireplace, his gaze unfocused as he stared into the flames. His earlier nervousness had only deepened, and Jessica could tell that he was preparing for something, perhaps for the moment when the truth would finally destroy whatever stability he had left. Julia Hawke, on the other hand, was seated by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost resigned about the way she sat, as if she knew the end was coming, and she had little left to fight for. And then there was Vanessa, standing near the stairs, her eyes cold and calculating as she watched Jessica approach. The moment their gazes met, the tension between them crackled. Vanessa had made it clear that she would stop at nothing to protect her family's secrets, but Jessica wasn't about to let fear or intimidation guide her actions. She had the truth on her side. "Mrs. Fletcher," Vanessa said, her voice laced with venom, "I see you found what you were looking for." Jessica didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked to the center of the room, where the others had gathered, and placed the journals down on the polished mahogany table. The sound of them hitting the surface seemed to echo through the silence in the room. Jessica took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You've all been hiding something," she began, her voice steady but full of authority. "But no more. The truth has finally come to light." Gregory looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while Julia's face remained inscrutable. "But Vanessa's eyes burned with defiance, though Jessica could see the flicker of fear that betrayed her composure. "These journals," Jessica continued, her eyes scanning the faces of those around her, "contain the truth about the Hayward family's past. The occult practices, the rituals, the murders, all of it. Thomas Hayward was close to uncovering something far more dangerous than any of you realized. And when he found it, you killed him to keep the secret buried." Vanessa stepped forward, her face twisted in anger. "You think you can destroy everything we've worked for, don't you, Mrs. Fletcher?" she spat. "You think you can expose us and walk away unscathed? You don't understand what you're dealing with. The Hayward family has power that goes beyond anything you can comprehend." Jessica stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "I understand far more than you think, Vanessa," she said calmly. "The power you speak of is nothing but an illusion. The truth will always come to light, no matter how hard you try to bury it." Vanessa's eyes flashed with fury. "You don't know what it's like to have everything you care about on the line, do you?" Her voice was rising, the mask of control slipping as her emotions took over. "You think exposing us will make you a hero, but you'll destroy more than you can imagine. My family, my legacy." Jessica shook her head, her voice soft but resolute. "Your legacy is built on lies and bloodshed, and it ends here tonight." For a moment, the room was filled with a tense silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for someone to make a move. Jessica could feel the weight of Vanessa's gaze, the fury behind it, but she stood her ground. And then, in the quietest of voices, Julia spoke. "You're right, Mrs. Fletcher," she said, her voice laced with a strange mix of relief and regret. "It's over. The family's secrets, they're no longer worth protecting." Jessica turned to face Julia, her eyes narrowing in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I didn't want this," Julia continued, her voice trembling. "None of us did. But when Thomas started digging into the manor's history, we knew it was only a matter of time before he found out the truth. And when he did, we couldn't let him expose it. But now it's all out in the open. The curse, the rituals, the bloodshed, all of it." Gregory stepped forward, his face pale. "Julia's right. We thought we could control it, keep it hidden. But we were wrong. Thomas was the one who saw through it all, and we couldn't stop him." Jessica's mind raced as she processed their words. "So it was you, Gregory," she said quietly. "You helped cover up the murders." Gregory swallowed hard, but didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded grimly. "It was the only way to protect everything we had left. But now it's too late. We can't hide from the truth anymore." Vanessa stood silent, her fists clenched at her sides. The anger was still there, but it was no longer directed at Jessica. Instead, it was a mixture of defeat and rage. Rage at the family's legacy crumbling before her eyes. Jessica took a deep breath and turned back to the journals. "This is the truth," she said, her voice resolute. "And now it's time for everyone to know it." Without another word, she picked up the journals and walked out of the room, her steps echoing in the silence. The confrontation was over. The secrets of Ashford Manor had been revealed, and the legacy of the Hayward family, built on lies and bloodshed, was finally laid bare for the world to see. As she left Ashford Manor behind, Jessica couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey she had just completed. The case had been more than just a murder. It had been a story of power, deception, and a family's desperate attempt to protect their dark secrets. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. The shadows of Ashford Manor would no longer whisper their secrets. The legacy of the Hayward family had been rewritten, and Jessica Fletcher, once again, had solved the mystery.